I'm Cliff May, founder and president of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. We appreciate you joining us for another FDD event. As you may know, FDD is a research institute exclusively focused on national security and foreign policy. We are nonpartisan and we accept no funds from foreign governments, never have, never will. We host many events through the year, all of which are available at fdd.org. Today, we are honored to be joined by the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, General James C. McConville, who recently returned from the Indo-Pacific, and there is much to discuss. Spurred by an increasingly daunting challenge from China and the People's Liberation Army, the United States military is undertaking its most significant transformation and modernization effort in decades. Each of the services is revamping operational concepts, organizations, networks, capabilities, exercises, and training regimens. The goal is to get U.S. combatant commanders what they need to compete, deter aggression, and prevail in combat if necessary. The stakes are nothing short of the success of America's service members on future battlefields, as well as the security of the American people, our allies, and our interests. Yet this modernization effort is taking place in the context of an essentially flat defense budget that may not improve anytime soon. During this period of change and uncertainty, there is an important debate regarding the optimal roles for each of the services and how finite resources should be allocated among them. Decision makers in both the executive branch and in Congress will have to set priorities and make tough choices. Today, we're pleased to have General McConville with us to help inform this important debate. He will be interviewed by my colleague, Bradley Bowman, Senior Director of FDD's Center on Military and Political Power, where he focuses on U.S. defense policy and strategy. He has tremendous experience as a former longtime Senate staffer, Army officer, and assistant professor at West Point. Thank you again for joining us today. Brad, I'll turn the floor over to you to introduce General McConville and begin the discussion.
Thank you, Cliff. I want to thank everyone watching. I hope you and your families are safe and well. I especially want to thank General McConville for joining me for this discussion. General James C. McConville is the 40th Chief of Staff of the United States Army. He's commanded at every level, including as the Commanding General of the historic 101st Airborne Division Air Assault. He spent a good portion of his long career abroad in dangerous places, defending Americans and our interests. That includes, for example, Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom. In addition to those operational commands and deployments, he also served as the Army Vice Chief of Staff, Army G1, and Chief of Legislative Liaison. I suspect each of those positions helped prepare him for what he's doing today. I would also note that General McConville is a senior Army aviator, qualified in the AH-64 Delta Longbow Apache helicopter and another number of other rotary wing aircraft. And he's a native of Quincy, Massachusetts. He has 3 children serving in the military, which is quite an impressive legacy of service. General, welcome. It's good to see you again, if only virtually. Thank you for making time to join me for this discussion.
Well, thanks, Brad. It's great to be here with you today.
I appreciate it. Before we jump into our discussion, which I'm excited to do, if I may just allow me to make a few comments to kind of set the scene for the audience. China is widely, increasingly, and inappropriately, from my perspective, recognized as a or the preeminent national security challenge for the United States. Much of this competition with the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, will continue to occur outside the military sphere, requiring a comprehensive strategy from the United States that goes well beyond the Department of Defense and employs in a coordinated fashion all the tools of national power. For that reason, I was glad to see the Department of State's policy planning staff issue a robust paper last week on the elements of the China challenge. But even the policy planning staff's paper recognized the Chinese Communist Party is, quote, developing a world-class military to rival and eventually surpass the U.S. military, unquote. Accordingly, as its second recommendation, this paper from the Department of State, they emphasize, quote, the United States must maintain the world's most powerful, agile, and technologically sophisticated military, unquote. That is exactly what the Department of Defense is trying to do. The policy planning paper also emphasizes that the competition with China is and will be global in nature. While this is true, we can expect much of the military competition with the PRC to, of course, play out in the Indo-Pacific. And that is what brings us to today's topic, the role of the U.S. Army in the Pacific when it comes to great power competition, particularly with China. Due to the vast distances dominated by the maritime domain, the roles of the Navy and the Air Force in the Indo-Pacific are widely understood. The important current and future role of the Army in the Indo-Pacific may be less well understood. I hope today's conversation will add some insight on this topic. The ultimate goal, in my view, is determining what mixture of U.S. military capabilities and capacities are required, regardless of what service provides them, in order to deter and, if necessary, defeat aggression from the PRC or others. So we have a little less than an hour, and with that scene setter that I hope is helpful, let's get started. General, you're just back from a trip to the Indo-Pacific. If you don't mind, where did you go? Why did you choose to go to those countries, and what are some of your key takeaways?
Yeah, the two major countries that we visited was Indonesia and Korea. This is my fourth trip to the Indo-Pacific since I became chief. So, I've been to Thailand, I've been to Japan, I've been to Singapore. I had an opportunity to go out there in Thailand and meet with most of the chiefs from Vietnam and from many of the countries out there. And the reason we went to Indonesia and we went to Korea is because of the importance of allies and partners in the region. And Indonesia is a country that we're beginning to develop a relationship we think is very, very important. They recently attended one of our Joint Readiness Training Center rotations with us. We have the capability to work very close and train together with them. And as many know, we've had a long-term ironclad alliance with the Republic of Korea and their armies. And that was an opportunity to meet with their senior leaders and continue to work the partnership and alliance.
That's great. When many Americans think of U.S. soldiers serving abroad in recent years for obvious reasons, many think of them serving in places like Iraq or Afghanistan. But some may not be fully aware of how many U.S. soldiers are already serving in the Indo-Pacific. Can you give just a general overview of the Army's current posture and activities in the Indo-Pacific?
Sure. We have about 90,000 to 100,000 soldiers that are committed either in countries forward or in places like Alaska or Joint Base Lewis McChord that are in Hawaii, that are in Guam, that are supporting operations in our presence in the Indo-Pacific. So there is a fairly significant portion of the Army that is committed to this region, and we think it's a very, very important commitment. We provide capabilities that the combatant commander needs, and we are there as necessary to provide the support that they need.
Many Americans, wonder, just why U.S. forces need to be stationed abroad, right? Why can't we have most or all the U.S. Army at, Fort Hood or Fort Bliss or Fort Bragg? Why does the United States need to have its soldiers forward stationed in general, but also what, from your perspective, based in part on all your travels, what is the value of having U.S. forces, particularly Army forces, stationed forward in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, first of all, I think by having forces forward, it shows our commitment. It reassures our partners that we're there with them. It also gives us a chance to improve their capabilities, their capacities. We work very closely together with our allies and partners. And, when we talk about great power competition, from where I sit, we cannot have great power conflict. And the way you do that, in my eyes, it's about peace through strength. And so we must have a strong military, but more importantly, our allies and partners need to have a strong military. And together, I believe that we can keep the situation in a stable and secure manner, which is what all our partners want. They recognize the need that they're going to trade and have economic interactions with China. They have to. It's really important for them. We certainly understand that, but they want to maintain the stability. They want a free and open Indo-Pacific. They appreciate the world order where everyone has a choice, and that's what they'd like to see continue.
No, that's great. So by as you know from decades of service, far better than me. I mean, by going abroad, We make Americans more safe at home, and we deter conflict that we don't want to happen because we have a forward presence that makes potential adversaries think twice. And while we're there doing that, we're helping to train them and make them more effective, ultimately reducing the burden on us. So that makes sense to me. You mentioned China. In your recent trip, if you may, if you're willing, and also kind of more broad conversations, what are you hearing from allies and partners with respect to China? What are they? I'm not wanting you to divulge any private conversations, but generally speaking, what are you hearing from allies and partners on China?
I think I kind of mentioned before. Most of our allies and partners have very strong trade relationships with China. They're very dependent on them for their economic growth, and what they would like is they don't want to have to choose. They don't want to have to choose. On the other hand, they want to have the freedoms they enjoy. They want a free and open Indo-Pacific, and they want to make sure that people aren't encroaching on their areas, things like fishing and some of the other things that are going on in the area. They do have some concerns about that.
Yeah, as you recently highlighted in your speech at the AUSA conference, the Army is undertaking the most significant transformation, seems to me, and I think you've said so, and it seems right to me, in about 40 years, 4 decades. This includes dramatic changes to doctrine, organization, training, and equipment. You've conveyed a sense of urgency when you've talked about it. I sense a real sense of urgency in your comments. You've emphasized that, quote, the time is now for this transformation. Why do you believe Army transformation is so necessary, and what makes it so urgent?
Well, as we look around the world, our competitors are really modernizing their armies, and they are competing with us with their armies. And I think as we come out of what I would call irregular warfare, counterterrorism, and a counterinsurgency focused army that's been using really the doctrine and the equipment that we developed 40 years ago. The time is now to transform the Army so we're in a much better position to compete, and therefore we can deter any type of conflict that may come about.
No, I saw that from my perch in the Senate, where we, because the Army was so busy doing important things and resources were finite, all the services had to continually postpone modernization. And as we were postponing modernization, many of our great power rivals were actively pursuing modernization programs in an attempt to leapfrog us. And so I actually quite agree with your sense of urgency, and I'm so glad to see the progress the Army and others are making, which we'll talk more about in a second. You said just a moment ago, and you've said in speeches elsewhere, that great power competition does not necessarily have to mean great power conflict. Obviously, no one wants a war between the U.S. and Russia. It's something we tried to avoid during the Cold War. No one wants a war between U.S. and China. That would be horrible and catastrophic. If we compete effectively, we can protect our interests, we can deter aggression, and prevent those very kind of wars we're talking about. General, what is the unique role of the Army? And it seems to me the Army has a comparative advantage here in competing before a full-scale conflict emerges. And how would those activities help the U.S. if a conflict did become avoidable? Talk to me about that kind of pre-full-scale conflict stage and what the Army does in that space.
Yeah, I think we're really taking a hard look at what we do in the competition phase. And it starts with working with our allies and partners, and give them an opportunity to go to our schools. What I find the relationship, when I go out into the Pacific, and I've met with most of the chiefs of staffs, the chiefs of staff that have gone to our command general staff college, the chiefs that have gone to our war college, the officers out there that have attended international military education and training, have a whole different vision of what the United States is all about. They respect our values. They respect our democracy. We work very, very well with them. They want to give that experience to their junior officers and NCOs. The Chief of Staff of the Army of Indonesia went to Norwich, has a master's degree from Harvard, and has got a PhD from George Washington. So he is very understanding of what America is all about. So we want them to go to our schools. We don't sell weapon systems, but it's good when they use our weapon systems because there's interoperability. And many are finding when they bought systems from other competitors they don't have access to parts, they don't have the things they need, and quite frankly, some of the quality is not very good. We've set up new units, the Security Force Assistance Brigades. And what they do is they work very closely with the conventional forces in our allies and partners countries, and they increase their capabilities. They're very good at building conventional forces, teaching them how to do logistics, teaching them how to professionalize their armies, and those forces are very much in demand. We run a lot of exercises. We run exercises in the Pacific, and we also, bring them to our combat training centers, so they get to see how to professionally train a force. And even in Indonesia, the Indonesian chief of staff is very interested in building a combat training center because he sees the gains that we make by training in our combat training centers. And then as we start to look at the multi-domain operations that, in competition, the ability to deter with new organizations, a multi-domain task force that can provide long-range precision effects and long-range precision fires, gives us the capability to maybe deter some of our competitors before we get to a crisis or before we get to a conflict. And the other thing, as far as the calibrated force posture that we like to talk about, there's some things we want to keep forward because that deters. We know if we have equipment forward, we can get there quickly. If we have forces there, they're already there. We don't have to worry about getting them there. And all those play into the deterrence and competition concept that we have.
No, that's excellent. At the end there, you made the comment in getting there quickly by having things, particularly equipment, right there already. Then we can flow people in if they're not already there more quickly. But in this age where I did an event a while back with the Transcom commander. He emphasized how every node that we have, if we have to transport units and equipment and people across large distances, those are opportunities for our adversaries to do all domain attacks on us, including the cyber domain. So that seems to be another reason why, in some cases, we would want to have troops forward. You also mentioned quickly SFABs, the Security Force Assistance Brigades. People like you and I who kind of focus on these things for a living will know. For the audience, these are, and help me get this right if I get it wrong, General, but these are specific brigades designed to do exactly what you're talking about. The Army is focusing, as it should, on great power, competition and potentially combat, but you also have these special brigades carved out, mostly in the active duty, some in the reserve, I believe one in the reserve component, right, that is doing just that, building partner capacity. And so the existence of those SFABs, those Security Force Assistance Brigades, seems to be a unique asset that the Army brings to exactly what you're talking about, kind of that pre-combat competition phase.
No, I think they are. It's amazing. We just set up our 5th Security Force Assistance Brigade in the active Army out at Joint Base Lewis McChord, and that SFAB is focused on the Indo-Pacific. It's already out there. All the countries out there want them to work with their forces. And what they have is people go, are these special forces? No, they're not special forces. What they are is they're very experienced leaders, former company commanders, former battalion commanders, former brigade commanders who have already successfully accomplished the job that they're advising, assisting in. So you get a very professional force that's going into a country and has the ability to to improve their overall capabilities and capacity very, very quickly.
So so if you take the SFABs and you combine that with the state partnership programs, for example, where you have state guards who are linked up with specific countries, and you add to that the robust menu of exercise you're doing, it starts to paint a picture of this pre-combat phase where the Army's playing, it seems to me, I'm obviously a little biased, a pretty decisive role. General, the Army and the Department of Defense more broadly, again, as you know better than me, are developing a joint warfighting doctrine. We're in this great dynamic period, perhaps overdue, where we're, as I said earlier, transforming everything. Kind of moving from the competition to, heaven forbid, a combat phase if deterrence fails. And this is really kind of one of the heart of the things I was most eager to talk with you about. What do you see in the future as the unique warfighting role and comparative advantage of the U.S. Army in a potential conflict in the Pacific, heaven forbid, with, for example, the People's Liberation Army?
Initially with some of the systems that we're developing, we're going to fight as a joint team. And a lot of people, in Washington, D.C., there's always a lot of competition for resources. But when we go into conflict, we go into competition, we're fighting as a team. And what we want to do is provide the capabilities that the combatant commander needs to win. Because really, at the end of the day, winning matters, and it is about winning. So when we start to look at the capabilities that we're developing, long-range precision fires, the ability to penetrate an anti-access aerial denial capability like we've never seen before. So if you look at what the other services are being challenged with, many of our competitors have put in place what we're terming an anti-access air denial capability. We use an acronym A2AD. It's a robust integrated air defense. It's a robust anti-ship capability, and this can cause challenges for our maritime and air forces. And what we have the capability to do is help them out. We have the ability to penetrate those with long-range precision fires. We'll very shortly have the capability to sink ships, so we can help them establish our own anti-access air denial capability. We can do strategic counterfire at long ranges, which is very helpful. We can provide fires. We also have, one of the biggest concepts we're working together with the Air Force and Navy. We call it Project Convergence. But what it really does is bringing the senses from the joint force together, and then using artificial intelligence is getting it to the right arrow in the quiver and using the right weapon system to respond. We just did a major test out in Yuma, and we're getting fire effects in seconds from when it used to take many minutes. And we find the future speed is going to matter. And so the Army has these type capabilities, the multi-domain task force, the security force assistance brigade. We certainly bring a lot of air and missile defense, and we bring a lot of logistics. And all this is going to be challenging because what we're going to have to really train ourselves on. Over the last 19, 20 years, we've been in combat, but we really haven't been contested in the sea, and we really haven't been contested in the air. So we've been able to move our equipment relatively freely around the world into a port. We almost have to go back to World War II to get an idea of what it's like to be contested in the sea. We're going to be contested in the air. There's integrated air and missile defense systems that we're all going to have to deal with. Where in Afghanistan and in Iraq, the air and missile defense of our was really very limited. It really was not what we would expect. So we're going to have to deal with that. And the other thing that, as far as for the Army is, we're going to have to protect our forces from air and missile. We haven't really had to do that for a long time. I checked the history. I think it was April 15th, 1953, the last time we lost a soldier to enemy air. So that just shows how well our air forces are doing. But in the future, we're going to have to protect them. And we're developing those systems right now. We're bringing mobile short-range air defense back into our organizations. We're very concerned about the proliferation of unmanned aerial systems and lethal unmanned aerial systems. We even see violent extremist organizations having them, and we're certainly going to see them in the next fight. So all these things are coming together, and we're going to have to work in all domains together to win the next fight.
No, thank you for that. I want to, in a moment, kind of delve into, maybe two or three specifics. You've talked about capabilities, which is excellent. In a moment, I'd love to talk about two or three specific systems that you're particularly optimistic or encouraged about that would be helpful to the joint fight in the Indo-Pacific. But before I do that, you mentioned a little bit of history there, which I find incredibly valuable. As you look at history and as you're leading this effort to transform the Army, are there any other major historical lessons or anecdotes that you look at to help inform what kind of Army you think we're going to need in the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, well, I look back to World War II, and some people have told me, hey, there's no mission for the the Army in the Pacific. And I go, well, wait a minute, I think we had 20 divisions during World War II. And at least, what I saw, that was a fairly significant force that had a lot to do with that. So, I mean, a lot of people can say a lot of things, but at the end of the day, you're going to put soldiers on the ground. You're going to have to do that. That's when you show the commitment. Any place of importance, your competitors or your adversaries are going to try to take. You're going to have to protect them with some type of ground force. You're going to have to protect your ear. You're going to have to protect all those type of things. So you're going to put people on the ground if you want to be decisive.
Right. No, and one of the historical examples I often look back on it as, and again, you probably are more familiar with the details than I am, but Task Force Smith in Korea, when we failed to provide our service members and units the training equipment that they needed, and we put fellow Americans in harm's way, not prepared to do what we asked them to do, and that's to me is the sad thing that can happen when we don't get this right.
Well, we all hope for peace, but we have to be ready for war, the military. And I was just in Korea right now, and it's amazing when you take a look at South Korea, how well developed that place and the quality of life that they enjoy. But right across the DMZ, there's a potential threat there, and we learned that many years ago with Task Force Smith. And we had the same question, the same discussion, talking about the importance of maintaining our militaries, our armies at a high state of readiness, because that's what prevents wars from happening. And if you don't, you'll end up in a war. And that's always hard to explain to people. They can't think of the unthinkable, but It doesn't mean it won't happen. We get a lot of history showing that when the Army wasn't ready, that's when we had our biggest problems. And we go back to World War II, Kasserine Pass, we can go to Task Force Smith, we can work our way through the history. And when we were not ready, we tended to lose the first battle.
What an important cautionary tale. General, I have some questions from reporters that, with your permission, I'd like to kind of weave in as we go along here. And it strikes me as now would be a good time for a question from Tom Bowman from the NPR, National Public Radio. He'd like to know, in light of everything you said, I think up to this point, I'm interjecting that obviously, whether you anticipate the need to deploy more soldiers. You talked about how many are already there. In light of the kind of capabilities you've talked generally about, do you anticipate in the next few years deploying more U.S. soldiers into the Indo-Pacific?
I don't think more. I think what we're going to see is the quality of the deployments. Very focused on working close with our allies and partners out there. So what we can see is, we want to increase their capacity and capabilities. We want them to invest in their defense, and we can help them do that. And again, it's the sum of all the parts that gets us the strength we need to maintain the peace out there. So we feel that with the exercises we're running, the deployments of the Security Force Assistance Brigade, Special Forces, and our National Guard soldiers are working out there, it all comes together to create a much more capable military and our partners. And then together we have a much stronger deterrence out there.
So I'd like to drill down, as I said a minute ago, into some of the more kind of specific weapon system or programmatic level details, if you're willing. So in the context of the Army's six modernization priorities, are there a few, 1, 2, or 3 specific research, development, test, and evaluation programs that, from your perspective, show particular promise and could be or will be particularly important in a joint fight in Indo-Pacific? Are there 1 or 2 you look toward? And let me just quickly add this. Paul McCleary at Breaking Defense, another reporter question, is wondering if you might be willing to elaborate on any Army efforts to develop, and you mentioned this a moment ago, shore-based fires that could actually target, Army shore-based fires that could actually target enemy vessels.
Yeah, well, first of all, number 1 priority is long-range precision fires, and that is moving along. We're very, very happy with this. Those who know the acquisition system, usually you're talking decades, not years.
Right. And unfortunately, right.
With hypersonics, we had a very, very successful test. We just did it. We're going to do another one next summer. We're anticipating having our first battery set to go in FY23, which is extremely fast. We are developing a mid-range capability based on the SM categories of Navy and also their Tomahawks. That's going to be land-based, so that's where we're going to get that mid-range capability. We have a precision strike missile capability that we're developing also. So all three of our, what we would consider long-range fires, ranging from 500 kilometers to 2,500 nautical miles, are all developing very quickly, and we're looking at having them in the force in really the next 3 years. So that's coming across very nicely, and they will fit in well in a deterrence mode in the Pacific, because they're part of the joint force. We take a look at future vertical lift. We're flying, which is really pretty amazing. 2 different companies are flying aircraft for our future long-range assault aircraft and our future attack reconnaissance aircraft. And the speeds they'll move in will allow us to operate Pacific between islands, like we've never done before. And that's going to give us some great capability. We're bringing together our integrated air and missile defense battle command system. All this is getting to bringing sensors and shooters together. That's going to make us much more efficient and effective in any type of air or missile attack that we may receive from our adversaries. We'll be in a much better position to protect ourselves. And so those are it, but we also have a lot of other systems that come along very nicely.
Right. And I'm glad you mentioned, as you went through some of those, when those would potentially be fielded, because I think sometimes there's an impression in the think tank community or some of the folks looking at the Pentagon that, a lot of this is like out there, right? We're so used to, like you said, these things taking 10 plus years, sadly, and the threat is just too serious and moving at such a quick pace. As you know better, we can't do that anymore. And so to me, as just a patriotic American, it's heartening to see a lot of these programs coming to fruition because of people like Brigadier General, John Rafferty, who's doing such a great job at long range precision fires. And so that's very exciting. So here I have a question from Sydney Friedberg at Breaking Defense, and this really kind of gets to one of the more sensitive areas, but I think important. And I'll just read it directly from Sydney. And here's this question. Is the Army going to fundamentally play a supporting role in the Pacific Great Power competition conflict with the Navy and Air Force in the lead, in particular as the Army develops long-range precision fires and air and missile defense systems, some of which you just talked about, will that let the U.S. create its own anti-access air denial bubbles around friendly islands? Is the service seeking an equal role to the Navy and Air Force in long-range strike and air and missile defense, or supporting role? And are these efforts complementary or competitive and redundant? That's the question from Sydney Friedberg at Breaking Defense.
Yeah, I think, we talk about between the services, what we want to do is bring options to the combatant commanders. So we're going to have long-range precision fires. If we can help penetrate for the Air Force, and that allows them to get in and do what they need to do. It's very similar to what then Lieutenant Colonel Cody did at the opening of Desert Storm. He did what we would call a penetration mission with his Apaches. I would not recommend that today, but at the time they were able to get out there and take out 2 air defense sites, and that allowed the air war to take off. So the way I look at it, there's going to be times when we're supporting them, they're supporting us. Historically, we've always looked at least from the Army standpoint, again, perspective is that we would be supported maybe by air, or we would be supported, maybe by naval forces for the decisive mission. But I can easily see where our role is to support, and especially initially. So what we're doing is develop the capabilities we think we need for this future fight. We're not trying to fight the last fight better. We're trying to win the next fight, and preferably deter the next fight. And so the long-range precision fires, a lot of things we can do with them. And if they enable maritime or Air Force maneuver, that's fine. But we're still going to have to secure things. You're still going to have to put troops on the ground. No one likes to think about this, but history tells us that if you want to win, you have to put soldiers and Marines on the ground and hold that ground. And so what we're doing is we're giving them all the capabilities that they need. That's transformational, so they're more lethal, they're more capable, and we're in a position really to deter, because the cost to those who wish us harm will be so great.
No, that's great. I'm among those who think that we need a larger Navy, and that's obviously going to require a lot of money. We got to modernize our triad, all these very, very important things. But one of the priorities of the National Defense Strategy is increased lethality. And if we can add that kind of strike capability you're talking about, that lethality, perhaps along the first island chain, make it mobile, then that would relieve potentially some of the pressure on some of the Navy's vessels to do other things. And it might provide this a same or similar capability, potentially at a lower cost. That seems to me one consideration possibly. I don't know if you disagree or agree with anything I said there.
No, I do. I actually, but the way I look at it, it's not a binary solution, either this or that. I think what you want to do is have multiple options. So if you're looking at it from where we sit, if you have land-based fighters, you've got subs, you've got carriers, you've got air, you've got all these different things that the enemy sees as dilemmas. So if he goes after the ships, we get them this way. If they go after this, you get them get multiple problem sets that they have to deal with. And that gives the combatant commander multiple options. He doesn't become a one option leader. So if he can't get the carriers through, he has no other options. He's got multiple. If he can't get air through, or he can't get the Army through, or there's something that limits our capabilities, or we can't get to this one island because they won't give us access. All these things come together. So the best forces are ones that have multiple options that you can use depending on the situation.
We want to complicate the job of their military planners as much as possible, right? And present them as many vectors that they would have to deal with so as to dissuade them from undertaking the aggression in the first place. So going back to what you said about some of these specific programs, and I have to ask this, some people roll their eyes when they hear this question because we hear it so much in Washington, D.C. and the Beltway. But just having spent the time in the Senate, it's something I feel strongly about. And I want to give you a chance to respond to it. And in order to ensure that we deliver these capabilities to our warfighters that you're talking about, how important, this is what they call a softball, but I want to ask, how important is timely, sufficient, and predictable funding from Congress? And to me, the more important, I think I know what you're going to say, but maybe more importantly, for people who don't track these issues daily, what are the consequences? What are the specific consequences for our readiness or security and our soldiers if you don't receive that timely, sufficient, and predictable funding?
Yeah, I just imagine trying to run a home and not have a budget. Just think about it. You don't know how much money you're going to have. You don't know how much to spend, and when you get it late. And as you know better, you worked in the Senate, and I spent a little time on the legislation. But what happens is you can't start new things. So we're often criticized for how slow we are in getting systems into place. So now we're accelerating, and we're moving very, very quickly. In order to field a system such as hypersonics in 3 years, there's no room to wait. You've got to get everything moving. And if we don't have the appropriations and we're on a continuing resolution, well, then we can't go ahead and purchase the things that we need to do. We can't start new projects. We can't increase production of our projects. It slows everything down because people don't want to spend money they're not sure they're going to have. And it's very, very inefficient in the long run. And even sometimes in the short runs, it hurts our soldiers and it hurts our families, because even things like housing and stuff like that, you can't fix. And so it's extremely inefficient. It's very ineffective. And as you said, we'll go over there and we'll show, we do it every year or just about every year, why we need timely, adequate, and sufficient funding, and predictable. We put that predictable because again, if you're working, and maybe for some folks that haven't with a budget, if you don't know how much money you're going to have, it's hard to make purchases that you need to do. You just don't. You just slow it down. You're afraid to spend money. Then you race at the end to try to catch up, and that's also very inefficient.
So in this moment where we're talking about transitioning from research, development, test, and evaluation programs to programs of record that we're fielding to the force to help to deter great power combat. At that moment, this is a critical window of 2 to 5 years. It seems to me where if we get this right, if we maintain funding levels where they need to be and we get it on time, we United States and our allies could enjoy benefits for decades to come. But if we mess this up and delay things, or heaven forbid cut some of these vital programs, it seems to me the consequences could be lasting and not good.
No, I think you've got it exactly right. I'm really concerned, and you heard me talk about we need to transform the Army right now. I feel as the Chief of Staff, if I don't get this done over the rest of my term, the 2.5 years, we have let our soldiers down for the future. 40 years ago, someone had the vision, the chiefs had the vision to go ahead and bring the Big Five on board.
Yeah.
We've used those, we incrementally improved them, but we have an obligation to put in place the right doctrine, the right organizations, the right training centers, the right weapon systems, really to take us over the next 40 years when we are going to have great power competition. So we have to do it.
You mentioned the Big Five, just for the listeners who may not be tracking that. These are the kind of the five big systems, Blackhawks and M1 Abrams, and these key systems that were conceived of, in the 70s and 80s, and right, and fielded in the 80s, roughly speaking, and that we're people are still using today in dangerous places. So we can expect that the very programs that you and your team are working on now, our children and maybe our grandchildren are going to be utilizing. So we got to get this right. General, another question from a reporter, Brian Bender, a little redundant, but it's slightly different twist on it. Brian Bender from Politico wants to get your response to what he calls a, quote, developing line of argument. This again, I'm not trying to set up a food fight because we're all Americans. It's one team first, but I am seeing this myself. The idea that with the anticipated flat budgets and growing threats in the Indo-Pacific, the Army will have to do less so the Navy and the Air Force can close the gap in the Indo-Pacific, a theater which calls largely for naval and air forces. You've responded a little bit. Let me just tag on to that to kind of add a new wrinkle to this, because you've covered some of this already. One of the key pay-fors that seems to be out there is the idea that we can cut Army end strength to some degree to pay for other priorities. How big of an army? Let me just go right at it. How big of an army do you think our nation needs, General?
Well, I think we've done studies, we've done testimony. I said about active duty, probably about 540,000 to 550,000. We're not going to get that. I can tell you right now, quite frankly, we don't have the resources right now, and we've been very well resourced. So if we want to modernize and keep the Army ready, then the end strength will not grow to that level. That doesn't mean we don't need it. It means the op tempo on our troops is a lot higher. But again, people are going to talk about cutting end strength, or flattening end strength. I think that what we can afford and what we probably need acceptable with a certain amount of risk is high 400,000s, 490, 495. We could probably live with that and do what we need to do if we have the right forces in place and we're very efficient and effective. I think as we start to become below those numbers, we accept a risk that I would not recommend as Chief of Staff of the Army.
That's very helpful. Thank you for that. So one of the,
I just something just since we're talking end strength, I just people say we don't need a big Army, and I say, okay, I'll agree with you. We don't have a big Army. When the Army I came into, active duty was 780,000.
Yeah.
During the peak of Iraq and Afghanistan, the Army active duty, this was Guard and Reserve, was 720,000 soldiers, and we were doing 15-month tours because we didn't have enough soldiers. And that was just for a regional fight. This was not great power competition. This wasn't a great fight. So we just need to put that in perspective of what it would take if we ever went to a great power conflict with the end strength that's needed.
I'm glad you added that. And, again, as you know well, it takes time to build units and to build a sergeant first class and to build a major, right? These are not things you can turn on and off overnight, to state the obvious, but it's an important reminder. And one of the great answers that I often hear through the years to people like me who ask questions, what kind of Army do we need, is, well, what do you want the Army to do? And what missions are you asking your Army to accomplish? And one of the ways I measure myself, the proper coordination strategy, right? Coordination ends and means, is whether we have that mix right between what we're asking the Army to do and whether we have the sufficient Army to do it, is the deploy to dwell ratio, or the bog dwell ratio. In other words, you know this well, but for the listeners, how much time does an individual soldier or unit spend at home versus deployed? And my data is a bit old. I'm confident you have more current data, but when I was looking into this issue, earlier this year, there were key parts of the Army, Army Aviation, which you know well, air defenders, special forces, and others who were struggling, if I remember correctly, to be at a 1 to 1.5 ratio, even down some near a 1 to 1 ratio. And for the listeners, understand what I'm saying. I'm saying you're home for a year, you're deployed for a year, or home for 9 months, something like that, or lucky if you get 18 months. These are patriotic people who want to serve their country. They want to be out doing things to defend our country. But just imagine what that does to an individual, to a marriage, to a family, if you're gone that long, not to mention the time, as you know well, General, you need when at home to train, right? And so would you be willing to provide just kind of an update on what current deploy to dwell ratios are, and how, if you have a cut to say 470,000 active duty armies, soldiers, what does that do potentially to deploy to dwell ratio?
Yeah, I think, as you said, you got it about right. Almost all our units are sitting somewhere, 1.5, 1.8. So what that means, I give an example of one of my sons. He was in a division. He came in there, and what you don't see is the training. So they have to go to the field, they train a bunch, and then they go to a combat training center, which is usually 30 or 40 days. And then they deployed to Afghanistan for 9 months, and that was a good deployment. They come back and they got ready to go into another training cycle, when they trained a bunch, and then he went to over to Europe and did a 10-month rotation there. So he was in that division about 36 months, and again, not home that much. And so we're trying to reduce that op tempo on our troops. And so you either have to reduce the mission, or you have to increase the amount of troops. As people talk about end strength, there's not a lot of talk about increasing end strength. At least you might have heard different circles, but I haven't heard a whole lot of people arguing over in Congress that the Army must have increased end strength. I might have missed that, but
yeah. No, that's excellent. In our remaining time, General, I want to have a few more reporter questions here, if I can. One of them is from Jen Judson at Defense News, and this is kind of the elephant in the room that we haven't talked about, the COVID-19 pandemic. She'd like to know whether the Army is thinking that you'll have to scale back the Defender Pacific exercise next year due to the coronavirus.
Yeah, we don't know yet. We're hoping, and I know hope's not a method, but with the vaccine that we're seeing, and again, we're starting to see very, very positive feedback on at least 2 vaccines. We have General Gus Perner, who is the head of logistics for Operation Warp Speed. So we're hoping that comes to fruition. And what we'll do is we plan on executing the exercise. We're doing some fairly significant tests around that with convergence. We're going to do a big hypersonics test. So there's going to be a lot of things that are going to be associated with that Defender series, and we plan on going forward with it. But again, we'll do the same thing that happened with Defender 20. We're an agile organization. If it's not safe for our troops, and we can't mitigate the risks, then we'll take the appropriate actions to do that.
That's great. Jen Ed Judson at Defense News also is wondering if you might be willing to provide an update on how the Army, or how you're thinking about Army pre-positioned stocks in the Indo-Pacific. Obviously, that's classified, a lot of it, but are there any unclassified details that you can share about how you're thinking about APS and how it might need to change in the future?
Yeah, I think when you think about we have a term we call calibrated force posture. And it's just like you mentioned earlier, there's places that we want to have our equipment forward. We have equipment on ships, we have equipment in certain countries, and what becomes important is to have some type of access and presence so we can bring troops in there very quickly. Of course, the country has to be willing to do that, and we are working with various countries in the region to have those type of discussions, but really don't want to go into further which countries are actually
Understood.
accomplishing that.
just the importance of having the right equipment in those pre-positioned stocks, and that it's well maintained and ready to go, like you implied earlier. A question related to Korea. You were just in South Korea. There's some news that our Apache unit there has been restricted in some of the training that it can conduct. I don't believe, has that been resolved? And do you have any concerns if this kind of continues over the long term, the ability of our Apache crews in South Korea to do the training they need to do?
Yeah, we had a discussion. I think, you know, I won't get specifically into the Apache crews, but it's just the discussion about the importance of no more task force miss. And you know, the way you do that is that our Apaches, our tanks, our Bradleys, all those systems we have over there, they have to train regularly, or you're not going to get the benefit from that. And I think that's very, very important. And you know, we had those type of discussions, always ongoing. But again, if you're a civilian in a lot of places, you go, I don't like the noise. This stuff bothers me. And, you know, and I try to understand that, but at the same time, I remember I was in Romania, and our strikers were conducting an exercise and go through a village, and one of the villagers complained about some of the dust the strikers kicked up. And she called the local police men and police station, and they said, well, would you prefer American dust or Russian dust? And she said, oh, no, I'm fine with that. So, I mean, there is sometimes a price for freedom. We want to be good neighbors when we're, you know, doing training, but it's really important that our troops train so they're really ready for the big game. No professional football team would go into a game without practicing. If they do, they would be very, very good. And that's really what our training is all about. It's about practicing. It's like a professional football team or any type of team, getting the repetitions so when the real big game, the Super Bowl, comes up, they're ready to play.
Well said. The South Koreans are such great allies and partners, and we've stood shoulder to shoulder for so long. We also know from top defectors from North Korea that one of the primary reasons North Korea has not invaded South Korea has been the presence of U.S. forces. So when I was a Black Hawk pilot years ago, and we'd get the phone call about noise complaints from the neighbors every now and then, we'd call that complaining about the sounds of freedom. So a little bit.
I mean, we do want to mitigate. We're working very closely.
Absolutely. Want to be sensitive to those concerns.
Again, for some folks, they you know, they just don't realize, and you know, and I understand their perspective. You know,
yeah.
Same thing with helicopters. You know, if they're flying over your house and it's not getting down, we just need to be careful about that.
It sounds good. It makes sense. Well, General, I think we're about out of time, so I want to sincerely thank you for your decades of service to our country and your current leadership of the Army. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I think it's been substantive and informative. I hope the audience agrees. On behalf of myself and the whole team at FDD and our Center on Military and Political Power, thank you. Please thank all the great soldiers that you lead for what they continue to do to keep us safe during these extraordinary times. I really appreciate it. Thank you again.
And thank you. It was great being with you.
Thank you. And for our audience, this concludes our discussion. Thanks for watching. For more on FDD's Center on Military and Political Power and our China program, please visit us at fdd.org.